Well, as you could tell, I'm not a historian. I'm also not a scholar of European studies, but my focus is on media. I'm an Austrian citizen, thus a European Union citizen, and I want to share some thoughts with you concerning some historical aspects of refugee crises, the plural, in Europe and specifically in Austria, and then some of the repercussions in the public sphere, the politics, and also the media. First, an overview and a few numbers. The movement, as you can see here, just in a sketch that doesn't even include the refugees yet from Afghanistan, but you can tell it's a complex web of escape routes from sub-Saharan Africa, from the East, from the Middle East, through Europe to mostly Western and Northwestern Europe, meaning Germany, Scandinavian countries, etc. Some routes even as complex as going over like the Arctic Circle to get into Sweden, as an example. And Austria is right in the middle of all of this. The main thrust over the last 2 years has been Syria. Next one, please. Where we have some data that about 4 million people were displaced out of the country, and another more than 6 million people, 6.6 million people, are internally displaced. And 1 million have, between 2014 and 15, have requested asylum in Europe. Those are UN refugees, High Commissioner for Refugees numbers. Overall, more than 1 million to the European Union in 2015 alone have applied. Depending on the sources, the majority, at least half of them, are Syrians, followed by Afghanis, then people from Iraq, from Africa, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, and former Yugoslavia. Still an escape route for not millions, but thousands of people. Now, 1 million sounds like a huge number, although, well, especially if you compare it to the 20,000, which I heard yesterday on the radio, may be admitted to the United States, if everything goes right, and it's not even out yet. 1 million sounds like a big number, but let's put this figure in perspective. There are about 500 million people living in the European Union. And even if you count the wealthier countries, it's about those that are attractive to the refugees, it's about 200 million. So depending on how you count, it's either 0.5% or 1/5 of 1% of the population of Europe would be those asylum seekers. So you might say, on the one hand, a rather small number in percentages compared to the overall population. However, if you, do we go one further? Let me see, go one further?
Yeah,
no, not yet, not quite yet, sorry. These comparisons are always difficult, and I don't want to stress any point that this is like it was then. But compare the numbers to the refugees after World War II. After World War II, around 1946, so after the country, the continent has been in ruins, and millions have died on the battlefields, in the concentration camps, as civilians, left and right, of starvation, you name it. There were about 12.5 displaced persons, DPs, on the continent. Mostly Germans that had to leave their original homeland because other governments took over, Czechoslovakia, Poland, other countries, to Yugoslavia to an extent, Hungary, etc. They had to leave. They were somehow taken care of. They were accepted, they were, they found new homes, new places in Germany to stay, even also in Austria to some extent, and even in other parts, including America for that matter. And it worked. Now, it worked because it had to work. I mean, there was no alternative. The Allies ruled the continent, and they made sure that these things somehow continued to function. There were displaced people, displaced persons, camps, etc., etc. So that was really a unique case and not comparable to what we're dealing with in the next half hour. Now, after the war in 1946, as Churchill said in a university in America, the Iron Curtain came down. The Iron Curtain divided Europe for a while into East and West. And it went straight through Germany. You can see here, this is what came to be the Federal Republic and the DDR, GDR, I think it was called in English, right? It also went straight through Austria. These were the Western Allies, the French, the British, the Americans, and the Russians. And Vienna, like Berlin here, was again divided into 4 sectors. However, jump ahead another about 10 years, Austria in '55 became independent, officially neutral like all these other grey countries, but firmly in the Western camp. So the Iron Curtain was like this. Yugoslavia was a special case. It belonged to the so-called non-Allied bloc, including India and other countries, and they were kind of left-leaning but not officially neutral. Austria was. Let's go ahead another year, and we had the first major crisis of independent new little Austria in 1956, the Hungarian Uprising. Now, in the Hungarian Uprising, about 200,000 Hungarians escaped from the country. Practically all of them through Austria. A lot of them went on to Canada, United States, etc. A number that I don't know by heart, but I'll tell you in a second, about 20,000 remained in Vienna. I remember these things firsthand because we had relatives. I was 7 years old then. We had relatives in Hungary who fled the country, stayed with us for several months, and had friends staying in other parts of Vienna. They formed like their own little exile community, and then they went on to a town in upstate New York called Utica, which they kept calling Utica in good Hungarian pronunciation. However, what I'm trying to say is that was an act of solidarity that Austria was proud of, had been proud of since then. I mean, there was no talk of xenophobia, there was no talk of what are these foreigners doing here. They were considered neighbors, they were neighbors, I mean, Hungary neighbors Austria, as you know. They were, in fact, we, the Austrians, were united with the Hungarians less than 40 years earlier in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy until 1918. And on top of that, we were united by the common feeling of anti-Soviet imperialism, because it was the Stalinist regime, that Stalin had been dead for 3 years, but it was still a Stalinist regime, that caused the situation in Hungary that led to the uprising. And the Austrians, especially those living in the Russian sector, knew that to live under Russians was not an easy existence. So there was this feeling of solidarity. There were no others, there was no othering, but they were neighbors, friends, relatives, and we helped them. Now, I want to mention a few other things in passing, because I really want to get to the present. But we had another such incident, to say the least, which was the Prague Spring of 1968, which ended in August 1968, which again led to 70,000 Czechoslovaks, which is still one country at the time, leaving immediately, and 300,000 altogether. Again, the majority through Austria. Now, the feeling was a little bit more ambivalent. There were some talks, these are too many, etc., but the overall atmosphere was one of, we gotta help them, we gotta integrate them, the artists did their things, the public media did their things, and the media by and large were all in favor of trying to help these people, actually more than official politics. There was one diplomat, the ambassador to Prague, who was kind of trying to belittle the situation somehow, and it's a little anecdote on the side, but that was a strange outlier. The majority said, hey, there is the tanks are moving into Prague, into Czechoslovakia, we got to help these people, and they did. They opened the borders as much as they could, they let people settle or move on to other countries. Move on another 11 years, we had the fall of the Iron Curtain. That was before the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. In May of that year, they actually physically opened the Iron Curtain with these big scissors and, you know, cutting up the barbed wire. There was some kind of a frontier border party in Eastern Austria, bordering Hungary, and they let this flood of Eastern Germans that were on vacation, quote unquote, in Hungary, because that's a place they could go to. You know, they were Eastern Bloc brothers. They went there, and as soon as the Iron Curtain was open, tens of thousands literally walked or had their little Trabant, these horrible East German cars. They moved through Austria, mostly to get into Germany. No problem for Austria at all. In fact, they welcomed... for signing up, yeah. I thought there was a note of protest, which I would have reacted to it. I would have reacted to it. By the way, anytime there's something I'm either being too fast or didn't make myself understood, please raise your hand or interrupt me. But what I'm trying to say about this movement in '89, again, there was not really a problem because, first of all, they were passing through. Second, same language, similar culture. They wanted to escape the GDR, which nobody could blame them for. They went through Austria. We were all heroes. We helped them. We, showed them the way. We showed them the indicators. That's where Germany is. Go ahead, go west, go that way. No problem. Well, a few years later, in the 90s, it began to be seen as a problem, the refugees, the Balkan Wars. In the 90s, as you know, Yugoslavia was falling apart in a nationalist turmoil between the Serbs and the Croats and the Bosnia-Herzegovinians and the Slovenians. Formed 4 new countries. And the first thing they did is they went to war with each other. Well, it was mostly, some of you have followed Wolfgang Petric in the summer course. He could tell you in detail what happened in former Yugoslavia. But one of the effects was that a lot of refugees reached Austria. I didn't get the exact numbers, but there were tens of thousands. And they came into a society, Austrian society, mostly the bigger cities, Vienna, etc., where there were already a lot of people from that area and from Turkey, the migrant workers. They had come officially, I mean, they were invited to, there's this famous saying, they were invited to work and they stayed to live. It was like, that was not foreseen. Yeah, you come, you make our machinery, you clean our houses, etc., but then you're not present. Well, they were present, and that was the beginning of what you might call a seed of xenophobia and of othering in post-war Austria, and that has been happening since the 70s, but at a low level. It was not a big issue, it was not a life and death issue, it was not a big, to some extent, the cultural and religious issues, because the Turks were Muslims and they started, doing barbecues with their lambs and sheep out in the open, and the Austrians didn't like that, and so there were all kinds of little cultural rifts, but it was not kept under the carpet, but it was sort of manageable up to a point throughout the 80s. In the 90s it increased because of this influx of refugees who now really needed our help. They mostly came with nothing, We managed to integrate them to some extent. There was an interesting example of a club for youth that was called Marshall, because of Marshal Tito, and they said, we all come from this former Yugoslavia. You are Serb, I'm Croat, he's Slovenian. It doesn't matter. We all speak a comparable language. We managed to at least live a decent life here in this new land, in this new country, and they did. So that was in the 90s. Again, it's not easy to compare all these situations to today. What I'm trying to say, there was a development that led from pretty much boundless solidarity to more and more suspicion, qualifications, animosity. And one may look at the current crisis by considering several dimensions, namely, they are the result of wars. They are the result of political, economic, and ecological disasters. I know some of you may know of the writings of Timothy Snyder, the historian. He pointed out that in Syria and Libya, definitely, the current crises were preceded by years of desertification, drought, famine, and people fled the land because there was nothing to live on into the cities. Exacerbated the situations, led to more and more tension and crisis, and then ultimately wars broke out, which a lot of people, abused and made. Not that you can use war positively, but they really, put these under their own agenda, mostly the Islamic agenda, but be that as it may, so the ecological situation is one such dimension. Then there's the humanitarian catastrophe at the sheer level, how do we feed 100,000 people, And then there's the logistical dimension, and the technical and financial challenge. What shall we do? Shall we keep them? Shall we send them back? What's the situation like? What do we expect? What are the predictions? That was what Europe in general, and your Austria in particular, had been faced with for the last approximately 2 years, since this refugee crisis escalated. And of course these dimensions are interrelated, the humanitarian, the political, the war, and the financial, etc. Now if we focus on Austria, we can see several stages of development and of conflicts in these last years. First, the pre-Syrian wave, which was mostly the Mediterranean influx of refugees. They came, mostly from Africa on boats. These terrible situations where a completely overloaded boat with 800 people just sank, and there were thousands of people, just dying in the Mediterranean Sea. The countries that had to live with the council, we had to accept them, they were mostly Italy, to some extent also Spain, Greece, but mostly Italy, because there's an island, you may have heard of it, Lampedusa, that is actually closer to Africa than to Italy, which is where a lot of boats landed. The Italians cried for help, the Europeans were very sorry, we have to do something. Well, it took months and months of doing nothing until a little bit happened. So the Italians were pretty much left alone, including by the Austrians. Nobody said, okay, let's take some of these people. They were happy that they were down there in Italy. Nobody cared too much. It was not yet a problem that was immediately felt by the country itself. Next slide, please, we can see one of the next wave actually came from Turkey. The many routes that people take on rafts, and the famous picture of the boy, this terrible picture about I think was it half a year ago or longer, I'm not sure, was it a year and a half ago? It's terrible how you fail to anyway. And they went up, and then what happened is Hungary started closing the borders. I'll give you the numbers in a second, and then they looked for other routes to go through Austria or to Austria and then on to Munich. They started closing the borders here in Austria. There was no border between Salzburg and Bavaria. You could just drive on the freeway. Well, I did last year, and I had to stop for 2 hours because they searched the cars, for refugees that should have registered in Hungary or in Turkey and not in Germany. And then there were all these countries. I was at the train station in Salzburg here, and the train station was literally, totally turned into a refugee camp. There's an underground parking lot in the Salzburg train station that's pretty big. It's hundreds of cars, on the underground. And there was not one car, and there were thousands of beds, or many hundreds. I'm not sure the exact number. That was last summer, last fall actually. Amazing, and a lot of organizations, the Catholic Caritas and the city and the state and the country and privates, there were donation boxes. People came by and gave 100 euros. It was pretty amazing. So I'll come to that interesting development in a minute. I just want to point out what happened. Next slide, please. Is that now the refugees, mostly from Syria, came by the thousands. This was still the open border between Hungary and Austria last summer, August 2015, and they came. And most of them wanted to continue to Germany or Scandinavia, but quite a few of them also thought, why not Austria? Nobody knew about Austria. Everybody knew, oh, Mama Merkel and Germany, it's the land of dreams. Austria was not well known, but people who started knowing realized that Austria is pretty much up there with Germany in terms of economic power and welfare and basically standard of living, etc. It's pretty much on the same level. So these waves grew. The political dimension was, what shall we do with them? Can we send them back? Because there is some law, some European law that they must register at that country where they arrive first. Or should we waive that law and just wave them through, wave in both, spellings and both meanings? Should we just wave them through to Germany? And they kind of waffled between one and the other thing, depending on the overall situation, what was feasible, what was acceptable. Because there was another dimension, it was the humanitarian one that I just mentioned in Salzburg, and we also witnessed it in Vienna. People came by the thousands. We can take a look. First we take a look at the numbers of people who went through this last year. So let's go one further. So don't look at the colors yet, but just at the sheer numbers. So in the second quarter of 2015, spring 2015, most of them applied for asylum in Germany. Second most in Hungary, because that was the first European country after Turkey that they reached, that might have wanted to stay, because Hungary is also relatively well off compared to Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. Then came Italy, France, etc. So these are the absolute numbers, but what is more interesting, next slide, is to look at the relative numbers, namely the number of refugees per 100,000. where Austria is fairly high up. There's Hungary at the top with almost 2,000 per. That's 2%. And then Sweden is 1.5%, and Austria is also more than 1% of the population. And Germany, which is a big country, 85 million people, I think, you know. So for them, it was only 580 per. And you go down and, okay, there's Slovakia, there's, I'm not sure what that even is, I can't remember. Croatia, yeah, not many people wanted to stay in Croatia, but a lot of people wanted to stay, and you got it. You got the classical North and Western countries here. So that's where a lot of people wanted to end up. To come back to the situation in Austria a year ago, and I think now we can look at two unusual kinds of developments, kind of reversals of what one would expect the classic political forces to be and to stand for. On the one hand, we had the Austrian Chancellor Werner Faymann, who is not Chancellor anymore, and he was also the head of the Social Democratic Party. Now, social democracy, as you know, would usually stand for international solidarity with the weakest and helping the neediest, etc. However, in this case, their constituency, their home base, the blue-collar workers either had by and large disappeared or they moved to the right because they felt neglected. It's kind of the drama of the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat, that they don't feel represented, they don't feel, they don't have a place in modern society, so they turn to a strongman. And the strongman is usually on the right side of the political spectrum. And I'll come back to that in a minute also. So there was this strange development that the Social Democrats actually began to take a harder line vis-à-vis the migrant crisis. And on the other hand, you had the German Chancellor, who still is the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, the head of the Christian Conservative Party, the Christlich-Demokratische Union, the CDU, that is, even though Christian its name, usually not known for international solidarity and helping the weakest. And it was she who uttered almost exactly to the day, on the 31st of August 2015, the famous sentence, "Wir schaffen das," we will manage. Let them come in, we will manage to integrate them. The estimated figure was 1 million would eventually come to Germany. And she said, let's do it, we will make it. And initially there was a big support for this attitude. People felt proud of, you know, Germany finally standing for something good, not only the soccer championship in, I don't know, 2006 or whenever it was, but we're doing something for real, you know, we're actually acting proactively in a humanitarian way. We're letting them come in, we're trying to integrate them, and now I'm getting, initially Austria was on that line. Austria, in many respects, has been following German politics, financial, business, economic policy, but also political decision-making, by and large following the German kind of model. And in this case, Werner Faymann, the Austrian Chancellor at the time, was very much in alliance with Angela Merkel. Here he is at a press conference in early 2016, but the rift was already there, and it actually ended in a kind of a separation of the, how can you say, a hostile attitude between the two. The more liberal, conservative Chancellor Merkel and the less liberal Social Democratic Chancellor, ex-Chancellor Faymann. The second, for many quite surprising development, was the emergence of what I had talked about already before, of a spontaneous movement in Austria, what you might call civil society, of spontaneous help, of supporting these people. We have 3 slides coming up. These are refugees arriving at a major train station in Vienna. Pannonia Bahn stands for they came from Hungary. They came by train also, not just walking. The second one shows the welcoming thing. You know, they had like tons of food and drinks and everything, and diapers and you name it. They had everything for the refugees coming in. And then I think it was in September, it may say in fall, there was a huge pro-refugee demonstration in Vienna in front of the train station. So there was this movement that caught some people by surprise, and in fact it was not supported very much by the major parties at all. The Green Party, that is not very important in Austria, it's about a 10% party, supported it. The left Catholic, some left Catholic movements, Caritas and other engagé movements and institutions supported it. and the left wing of the Social Democrats supported it, but not many other people. So it was really, if you want, an almost a standalone movement that continued, is still going on. They're not there anymore by the thousands in the train stations because they don't arrive anymore, but there's still activity trying to help these people, integrate them. There are families that put up with, unaccompanied youngsters, and they pick them up in the refugee camps, and they do all kinds of, I would say, quite useful things. This was a statement against the general feeling and the general reality that Austria is politically moving to the right. You may know that when this trend is discussed in Europe, you have the usual crown witnesses. You have Marine Le Pen in France, you have Geert Wilders in Holland, you have Nigel Farage in England, and you have Hans-Christian Strache in Austria, who would say something like, our country first against Islamization of Europe. Those of you who know Austrian dialect, he says, Daheim statt Islam, meaning at home instead of Islam. You know, that's the slogan that was very catchy. Against foreigners stealing and raping and abusing the social welfare system. This may sound familiar to you in your own country. These two developments, on the one hand the move to the right, and on the other hand that humanitarian civil society move, they ran parallel and resulted in a shift in the political dynamics in Europe in general and in Austria in particular. And I want to limit myself to Austria. There was this movement to the right, as I said. However, one thing that the Social Democrats helped get through was that they said, okay, we're going to set a limit. We're going to accept 39,500 refugee asylum seekers per year. Why they discounted from 40,000, I don't know, but the number was 39,500, and you will see that number coming up in something I'll show you at the end. And then that's it, you know. Now, the opponents to this idea immediately argued, the lawyers said, you cannot do that. There is a convention, a UN convention on refugees. There is no set number. You have to accept as many people as seek help when they run away from a war, rather than being killed. There is no limit. But the government had its own legal expert that said, no, you can't do it, because A, B, C, D. I'm not a legal expert, I don't know the details, I don't know who is legally right, but it is pretty clear that the government in Austria, which is still a very weak coalition of the Christian conservatives and the Social Democrats, they wanted to say, okay, we're going to do something about it. This German Angela Merkel thing hasn't worked. We're going to be tougher. We're going to be more realistic in political terms. We're going to set limits. And the limit is this strange number. There was an interesting partial exception to this trend. Last fall, the city of Vienna had its regional elections, so, you know, who's going to run the city government. And everybody thought that the Social Democrats who run the city would lose in a landslide because of all the developments of the previous year and a half. Well, they did lose, but much less than expected. They lost only about 5% of their vote, and they were expected to lose 15%. The Greens stayed stable. They are the junior partners of the coalition in Vienna. And the right-wing party gained, but again, by far not as much as they thought. Again, just a 5% increase, which was not a whole lot. However, I said before that Austria is moving away from the German line, but just a little aside, this is now less about Austria, but I'm sure you're familiar with the incidents of last New Year's Eve in Cologne. Next slide, please. That there were these incidents of sexual harassment and abuse and threats and everything of hundreds of women by hundreds of young men, and most of them very obviously migrant workers, and they were identified as such also. And that caused a big uproar and a big change of opinion over the following months, the last half year basically, in the German public opinion. As you know, Angela Merkel is now on the defensive. She may not win the next elections, and within her own party there's a revolt against her. And she is, you might say, in political trouble because people accuse her of having permitted something like this to happen. Now, a little aside on the aside to show you how complex the situation is. In the weekend edition following New Year's Eve, the very highly renowned Munich paper Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of the reputable papers in Germany, had an illustration on its cover trying to symbolize what had happened in Cologne. Next image. That was the illustration on the cover page. And it was immediately attacked from all sides. Now, the feminists saw, of course, a male chauvinist attack, no matter what. The politically correct people saw a racist attack because the hand is black and the legs are white. I mean, maybe a bit facetious to say, well, it's a black and white illustration. Turning it around wouldn't have made more sense, but be that as it may. And the right-wing people were also unhappy because it said this is very abstract, could be anything, you know, it doesn't really point to the fact that there are racist abusers of our freedoms and the migrants and the Islamists, and let's throw them all out, you know. So it shows how difficult it is to stay the course. And the Süddeutsche is definitely not a right-wing or warmongering or anti-liberal paper at all, but it was in deep trouble because of that illustration. Let's go back to Austria. Like in many other countries, this crisis has deepened over the last year or more, and it has begun, as I said, already with the migrant workers and continued with the influx of ex-Yugoslav refugees, and it escalated. Now, the picture is somewhat complex because, for example, the business community within the conservative establishment, they are not that much against this influx of people because they say, hey, we need the workers. Austria is an aging society, like Germany, and like, as we heard yesterday on the radio, like Japan, which is the oldest, so to speak, the most aging country in the world. Well, Austria has a pretty weird aging pyramid as well. So we actually need an influx of young people. Well, the other side would say, yeah, but we need the right people. You know, ideally, I don't know, young blonde Germans, I don't know what. But in any case, so even within those camps, there are different, you know, opinions and different factions, so to speak, of you know, arguing pro and against. So the conservative, by and large, population fears that they fear for a Christian European Union undermined by radical Islamists, and it's too early to tell whether those fears are justified. I mean, everything is in flux right now. However, one thing is for sure, namely that these fears, as well as the hopes for a morally better country, are discussed and fought out in the public, in the media. And as far as public opinion and reactions are concerned, one can look, among others, at public opinion surveys. There aren't that many yet. On electoral outcomes, I'll come to a second one after the city of Vienna in a minute, and to opinions voiced in the social media, about which we will also hear in a minute, in letters to the editors, in discussions in media and similar. Now, the elections are a mixed picture. I already pointed out the fairly, let's say, non-extreme outcome of the Vienna elections last, I think October it was. And we had another election that you may have heard about because it was quite an unusual thing for Austria. They were a presidential election, so the president is the official head of state. He's not the chancellor, but he's like the figurehead. It's sort of like in Germany you have a president, then you have Chancellor Merkel. Well, we had a president for years, Fischer, and we had a Chancellor Faymann, and now we have one called Kern. The president was up for elections. That was in April. Nobody gained absolute majority more than 50% because there were 6 candidates, not the usual 2. It used to be that ever since World War II, the Christian conservatives and the social democrats basically divided up among themselves who will be the next president. Not among themselves, but it was either one or the other. It's back and forth. It was a Christian conservative, a social democrat, maybe twice, Christian conservative again. Wildtime, remember, of the 80s, Christian conservative. And it has been a social democrat now. Well, the 2 candidates of those 2 parties were among the also-rans. They didn't even reach 15%. The 2 winners, the highest 2, the ones that would go into, you know, the second round that needs to be to determine who will be president, was a officially independent candidate but really supported by the Greens, and the other one was supported by the right-wing FPÖ. Now they were the 2 highest up. So there was a second round in May. The Green candidate won by a margin of about 30,000 votes. The conservatives, the right-wing nationalists, discovered some irregularities, went to the courts, contested the elections. The courts, the Supreme Court, agreed with them. There's going to be a third round in October. So, and a lot of people fear, with the events over the past few months, including now April, May, June, all the way, that the fears and the fear-mongering has increased, and that the right-wing candidate has a good chance of becoming the president. That means that about 50% or more of those who voted are in favor of a candidate who represents a party that is anti-immigration, anti-Islamic anyway, to a good extent anti-European Union. In fact, the candidate has said he would want a referendum on whether we even want to stay in the European Union. He took it back, but the word is out, you know. So the EU is not a necessity. It's an option. We may choose it, we may not choose it. And the situation would be add another little stone to, or subtract another little stone from the European Union. The first big stone was, of course, the Brexit, you know. But if this continues with little, Austria is not that important, but, you know, France may be next. So it's a very strange and unforeseeable dynamic that is being set into place right now. And I want to cite some examples of positions in the traditional media. But before I do that, I want to hand over to my son Philip, who knows much more about social media. Some of you may remember him. He co-taught a course this summer on international crisis, and he has been following the Austrian situation without knowing that he would have to speak here on the social media much more than I did. It's a generational issue, I guess, and he may have to say a few words. At least I invited him to do so.
Okay, so I'm going to keep it real short because we're running out of time, actually. Basically, with the situation we're seeing in Austria, I would argue that what's happening in the social media is the same thing that's happening in social media in whatever situation politically you're facing. Social media really is a tool for organization amongst people, direct organization. So last year, exactly a year ago, when Merkel issued her "Wir schaffen das," we can handle this, you really saw a massive influx of people, and most of them wanted to actually go to Germany, but they all passed through Austria, and it was a dire situation. It was an extremely hot summer, up to, I don't know, 100 degrees or so. These people had been walking for months, and Austrian politics didn't really do anything about it. So this huge movement in civil society was mainly organized through social media, and you had all these cries for help, and you know, people started connecting and organizing, and social media certainly was a very important tool in that. It's something that's being cited again and again if you look at recent social movements and crises, that how social media enables civil society to organize. I guess it first came up already in the Arab Spring, which is kind of one of the root causes of the situation that we're facing now. How as a tool of mobilization, of organization, this is really helping civil society to organize. But then as the situation went on, of course, social media as a platform also enabled the other side, the right-wing, xenophobic parts of the society to organize, because, and I think this is something that you're familiar with as well from the United States, there's a large sentiment in the right-leaning part of the population that the media is controlled by some liberal elite that don't tell us the truth, and they're all biased, and they're keeping the real incidents from us because they want to, you know, hide what's really happening out there. So social media, of course, then gives this portion of the population an outlet to kind of show every single incident where a criminal act is committed by a person of non-Austrian descent. And of course, this is something also in this entire situation, also with Cologne and all these things happening. There's a general mix-up of refugees and asylum seekers on the one side, and migrants and undocumented migrants on the other side. So basically, you know, every single time when you have an incident with a person of non-Austrian descent, this is of course immediately put out on social media to show that, you know, Merkel has brought in all these rapists and murderers, whatnot. So, and I'm gonna leave it at that because we're really running out of time. I guess you want to ask some questions afterwards. But it enables organization outside of the traditional media channels, where you have a certain gatekeeper function, where certain things might not be discussed or might not be possible.
Do you have a couple of examples of social media on your slides?
These are not my slides, and to be honest, I just said these things off the top of my head. I can really give you some examples for the organization that's been happening. So, friends of mine back home, we have a large community of exiled Kurds in Austria, because the Kurds have been prosecuted in Turkey for decades already. So I have some Kurdish friends back home who would start basically a movement to help these migrants. So they would, start calls on social media to get to organize clothes and food and baby food and all these things to kind of get these people stuff. When they come over the borders, they would very often be dressed in rags, and as the situation dragged on and it came more and more towards winter, of course these people coming from Syria would not necessarily have winter shoes and jackets that are fit for central northern European winters, where you have snow and freezing temperatures. So all this was organized. People would be organizing convoys to drive down to Greece, where the situation was most dire, to bring stuff there. People would, we had a short period where the Hungarian right-wing populist government would completely close its borders and not allow these people to travel on to Austria and Germany, actually in conformity with EU laws. So you had convoys of people organizing to go to Hungary and to illegally smuggle refugees over the border to Austria to help them to get to a place where they wouldn't be in internment camps and very bad situations. So all these things were enabled. On the other hand, the situation in Cologne is a good example, where the German media did not report on these incidents for more than 3 days. These were kept quiet, and it's been an ongoing accusation.
Including by the police.
It's been an ongoing accusation that in order not to foster resentment and hatred on the right-wing part of society, things are kept in the dark. But these were huge incidents. They were initially not reported or misrepresented in the media, but they got out nonetheless. And this, of course, was a field day for racists, and they organized very well on Facebook and Twitter and whatnot. So.
Okay, and by the way, a thing that I'm not going to go into, but as you know, they're building walls now, left and right. Wall building apparently is very fashionable these days. Hungary has built walls, I think Serbia has been building walls, or Bulgaria has been building. Yeah, Austria has been building walls. They don't call them walls; they call them like security devices or something. But they're walls basically. Okay, I'm going to, as you said rightly, we're running out of time. I'm going to shorten my last piece, which is only. It's going to be a few minutes only, to talk about thank you, by the way, very much for this input, and talk about the traditional media. One word only about, or one sentence only about the public television, which is still the major game in town. They try to keep a fair and balanced, not in the Fox sense of the term, but a seriously fair and balanced reporting of the facts and what goes on. There's a big ongoing action. It's called Light in the Dark, Licht im Dunkel, to help refugees and migrants, and they do all these things. I would say that by and large, the broadsheet press, which I'm part of, so I'm biased, is also trying to report rather than to foment and to agitate, and we try to keep facts separate from opinion. I want to focus on one example, that is the tabloids in Austria. Tabloids in Austria play a special role. Austria has had one major tabloid for many decades that has a circulation that covers a share of the market, 40%, which is the highest share in any market of a regular major country. I mean, Monaco may have a higher share, it's only paper, but we're talking about a real country. 40% is huge. It's now down a little bit to 38 because there's an aging population and because there are two competitors now. One is not really a competitor, it's the same family, but they run a free paper, and the other one is a competitor. It's also a free paper. Of course, they're not free. The readers are targets for the advertisers, so there's some money is there all the time anyway. Now, if we continue, I show just two examples of what these. This is the Kronenzeitung, the traditional 40% share paper, and it says, you know, this is why Austria's problem: strong increase in the number of refugees. That's a typical headline of August 2 years ago, actually. And this, I don't know when it's from, but it's the typical thing. There's a shock after the heat. That's very important. Test your cancer risk. And the guru attackers were asylum seekers. You know, you don't know what it's about. Those are typical headlines. Well, I wanted to originally give you an analysis of these tabloids and how they influence opinion making in the country. But what happened is, on my way to the airport when I came here into the country in August, early August, I picked up these two free papers, the Österreich and the other one, Heute, and I looked at the City Beat, which is, you know, the pages where they have the, you know, the thefts, the robberies, the fires, the murders, that kind of stuff. And lo and behold, I needed to do nothing but photograph all these various news items that they had. You're going to see 13 examples. 12 of them say where the perpetrator, the thief, the murderer, whoever, the ethnic or national background of that particular person. One does not. Guess which? So let's go through them rather quickly. I mean, I don't want you to read all this stuff, but that's basically what it says here, you know. A Pakistani dealt with train tickets. Okay, that's a major headline. That is Österreich. This is, I don't know which of the two papers it is, doesn't matter. Or is it actually Kronenzeitung?
That looks like Kronenzeitung.
Yeah, maybe it was. But it was these two papers anyway, both from the same day. You know, an African man pushed a woman, tried to tear off, didn't, but tried to, bad enough. It's really bad, it's not fun. But you know, you have one photo, of course you show the photo twice, same guy, pretty much the same photo actually, but here it's enlarged. Next one. An Afghan person stabbed somebody with a knife. Very important Afghan. Hungarians stole 400 bikes. Hungarians did it. You know. We've got so and so many foreigners already on minimum Mindestsicherung, minimum collateral. The Christian Democrats insist on a report, end the welfare chaos, etc. Government is getting serious. Closed borders, regulation meant to keep away the refugees, and then there's this thing against a very nationalist attitude against the Turks. You know, somebody said, you know, to our chancellor, you know, piss off, infidel. You know. Next one. Yeah, remember I told you this is. I'm sorry, I said 39,500. It's apparently 37,500, and he says almost in a joke fashion, you know, 37,501st asylum seeker. Sorry, he's gonna have to wait. You know, it's like, okay, the line stops here. You know, next year, come again. So this was an interview with the Interior Minister. Next one, this is Österreich, the paper. The government is arming against terror. There is no terror in Austria, to be honest. I mean, there may be one day. Okay, maybe very proactive, but they talk as if we are living in times of terror. Nothing happened in Austria so far. It's nothing, not even compared to Germany. You know? Next, we have, again, the 400 bikes in the other paper. Ungarn, again, Hungarians. Again, the same situation about the guy in the subway. Next. A former refugee from Kosovo went crazy because she wanted a divorce. And next, somebody murdered a hairdresser woman. And the question is, will the killer be freed before the trial? You don't hear where the guy comes from. Well, he's Austrian. Okay. So much for that. Let me briefly reiterate, we're coming to an end anyway. So Austria shows the symptoms that are spreading throughout Europe in the face of the refugee crisis, or at least it shows the symptoms in the better off EU countries. A growing gap between what you might call a socially liberal wing that wants to solve the issue while considering humanitarian aspects, following international laws on refugees, and or at least sober considerations regarding the necessity of workers. And on the other side, a growing wing that considers national and nationalist arguments first, insists on a patriotic non-Muslim culture, is very skeptical of the EU and sympathizes with authoritarian regimes such as Putin's Russia. Conclusion, there is no conclusion. What can be said is that Austria may be, for better or worse, a miniature testing ground for the European developments already underway and still to come. And I want to thank you for your audition and for bearing in this heat. And if you have any questions, I think we have about 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay.